Thank you, Audrey. Welcome to our segment two, where we are focusing on support systems and financing. And as Audrey has already introduced our panelists, we really want to thank Mr. Duncan Stewart, Honorable Earl Jarrett, and Mr. Stuart Barnes for joining us today. And as we did in the first segment, and I know that it was quite an exciting segment hearing the different perspectives, we are going further to hear from the automobile industry, business sector, and also from the finance sector. So we're going to give each of you 4 to 5 minutes to give us your perspectives. And remember, today is about connecting the dots as we develop the electric vehicle, electric mobility sector. So I hand over to Mr. Stewart to give us your initial comments.
Well, thank you so much, Dionne, for inviting us today. Thank you to JPS, thanks to JPS. The dialogue that we're having now is very important for the development of this electric mobility. So if I could kind of, give a lay of the land, so to speak.
Sure.
So electric mobility is the future of mobility. The market of cars is going to change to electric, whether we like it or not. But the time frame is fuzzy. So, some car makers have made bold pronouncements that by 2025, some have made commitments by 2040. Of course, electric mobility is, multiple faceted. We heard earlier when Therese Turner-Jones spoke about Barbados. So we have, the commercial applications, whether it is public transport, as Barbados has done with their bus system, whether it is, commercial transport for garbage trucks or commercial trucks, or, whether it's some commercial application like the movement of tourists, movement of people via taxis. This is one application, and electric mobility is very compelling for that application because of the high mileage, high fuel consumption, high cost.
Okay.
The other is, passenger vehicles for cars for you and I. And so, perhaps this is where we have to think about how do we develop this market. If we look at Jamaica, all of the rationale around electric mobility to do with climate change, to do with greenhouse gases, to do with tailpipe emissions doesn't resonate with the majority of our motoring public. And we have a uphill battle to take that message, to make it compelling, and for it to become internalized by as many people as we can. I think that the things that we spoke about today, many of the panelists spoke about. Government regulation is important.
Yeah.
It spoke about, putting in place structures that will enable this new form of transportation. So from the car dealer's point of view, the message that we want to get across is that electric mobility is not just about battery electric vehicles. Electric mobility includes plug-in hybrids. Electric mobility includes mild hybrids. And if we look at the supply chain, what we're going to see is that right now, plug-in hybrids are available in the market. We already have them on the road, sold by the dealer network. You can go into showrooms and see plug-in hybrids. But battery electric is coming. And when I say coming, I would say coming this year.
Okay.
So you will be able to go into a dealership and see battery electric vehicles this year. But you will not have the range of choice that you're accustomed to. And this is mainly because of the trade-offs related to battery size and weight and vehicle design of SUV versus passenger car. How does that impact battery choices? So, you're more likely to see a vehicle that is a crossover or a hatchback style car than a full-blown, full-size SUV that Jamaicans favor. So what that means is that, you know, people who want to adopt battery electric vehicles this year are going to have to make consumer choices like choosing a smaller vehicle.
Okay.
And that's not a bad thing. That's good for the environment. It's good for climate change. And, you know, we need to get that message across by allowing people to experience these cars and see that they're able to do what they are able to do now with these cars. The other thing that we need to look at is that the taxation on electric cars at 30% versus 45% is not compelling enough to make the price point attractive. So if we want battery electric vehicles to be adopted in the market, we're going to have to look at where pricing is.
Okay.
And our perspective is that taxation around 15% will drive adoption of battery electric vehicles when they come to market. The next thing that we have to look at is surrounding standards for charging. So, you know, we have a very complicated supply chain in Jamaica. We have imported used cars from a variety of source countries. We have, you know, vehicles coming from the manufacturers' representatives. And, you know, they all have different charging standards. And we need to be careful that we have the right fast charging standard, because the time that it takes to charge is going to be one of the single biggest impediments to people adopting cars. It takes you 10 minutes to fill up at a gas station. A fast charger is going to take an hour and a half. A slow charger is going to take 6 to 8 hours. So what it means is that people who adopt battery electric vehicles have to be quite deliberate around how they fuel their vehicles. And so standards around what charging is available is very important. And then we heard, you know, from the previous panelists how important it is for us to have training, how important it is for us to have emergency services, understanding high voltage systems. So the fact of the matter is that these cars are much simpler than internal combustion engines, but they are different. And this difference poses a safety issue. And this safety issue means that when you approach a car that's been in a serious accident, you can't just touch the car. Okay. You have to be mindful of what's going on with this car. And, you know, how would emergency personnel tell the difference between an internal combustion car and a battery electric car? Because it won't be obvious. So, you know, this training that we discussed about, you know, Heart NTVA, getting it into the curriculum, you know, and I'm really glad that the IDB JPS Foundation project is tackling that head on, because it's really important. And then if I could close out, you know, what's important, I think, is the communication as we go forward. So the IDB is funding, you know, several pilot projects that will deliver information around total cost of ownership. You know, will let people understand why is an electric vehicle better than an internal combustion vehicle. And it's important for that to be communicated to the market. The dealers have a part to play in that. You know, we are a quote-unquote experience center. So people are going to come to us to understand what electric cars are about. And we need to make sure that this information that comes out of the projects is available to the public.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sir Stewart. That's a lot that we have just got there. And I know, Mr. Jarrett, you're going to give me a lot more for me to consider.
We're going to keep it tight. Dionne, I must recognize and thank JPS and the IDB for convening this and to officially launch the introduction of electric vehicles in Jamaica. It's good for Jamaica. It's good for the economy. It's good for our climate and our health of our people. And, mobility, as you have heard earlier, represents over 30% of the GDP of our country. I must share with us, though, that electric vehicles were invented in 1828. But they could not compete with the oil and gas industry, where you had a greater infrastructure network. You heard a while ago that it takes 2 to 3 hours to charge a vehicle, or 6 hours. You just get your gas in, 10 minutes. So they couldn't compete in those days with that industry that had emerged after Henry Ford produced his Model T Ford, which was done by using modern technology at the time. One of the disadvantages of electric vehicles then and now was the range of the vehicles. When you travel and Jamaica has a big hill that cuts the country in half, and therefore you're going to need a lot of energy to cross the highways to get to the north coast. And therefore you're going to need to have charging points across the island if somebody's going to effectively use an electric vehicle to travel Jamaica. And that is an obstacle that we have to defeat. But then that is also an opportunity to build out an architecture to support the electric vehicles. And that's an opportunity to create some jobs across the country in that process. Those jobs that are created, and I imagine over time it will be a few thousand jobs. We heard that just in the pilot phase we could create some 50 jobs. But if you think about this thing going over time, you could be creating thousands of clean jobs for persons in Jamaica. And we need to look at that aspect as well. Duncan mentioned, and earlier in the panel, we mentioned the training of mechanics and emergency response personnel. That is critical. Yeah. As he said, if you were in a crash, and to be extracted from that crash vehicle, you can't just have the old-time Pete, the mechanic, come with his screwdriver and apply it to the car. Otherwise, Pete could be fried. And so we have to now train people as to how to deal with electric vehicles, how to deal with these vehicles in the event of a crash. How do you deal with the persons or occupants of the vehicle? And of course, there are additional risks. You're driving on top of a lithium-ion battery, which in some instances we have seen how they react to crashes and impact. And so therefore we have to think and plan for that. But on the good side, the electric vehicles will impact positively our environment, will allow us to meet our commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations and the commitments we have made with our multilateral partners around the world. And so if we're to reflect on the health side of EVs, the reality is that Jamaica, whilst maintaining our standards, are operating below the standards for air pollution. That is only in the aggregate sense. When you get to certain cities, for instance, in Jamaica, we measure air quality in places like Halfway Tree and Crossroads where the buses converge. Mm-hmm. We're not doing so well in those smaller areas, but nationally, our air quality is quite good. But as you know, in Jamaica, we have a high case of respiratory diseases. Almost every Jamaican suffers from asthma. And in 2017, we had 1,230 persons dying from respiratory or illnesses caused by air pollution. And what the electric vehicles will do, particularly if we're able to transition to public transportation, buses and taxis, is that you could find a reduction in the deaths caused by unhospitalizations caused by pollution. And one needs in the policy formulation to consider the cost associated with hospitalization and medical care compared to the cost of the infrastructure that we're going to build up. And also there's an opportunity for the private sector to participate in the infrastructure building. Mm-hmm. And if you were to go to London today, you'll find your taxi comes up and it's making no sound. It's typically a hybrid vehicle. Mm-hmm. And so in the policy formulation, we probably have to look at whether public transportation, whether we should mandate that the taxis be hybrid, or or electric vehicles. And those are considerations that we should take. We also need to look at JUTC and the buses that we have in the country, whether we should move as many larger cities have done. If you go to New York City, the MTA, the buses are electric buses or hybrid buses. And if you go to South America, many of the cities in Argentina are using electric buses. That is a policy decision that we need to have the government consider. And not just consider, we need to sort of press the government to move in that direction. Electric vehicles have advanced over the years since 1824 or 1828. Today you have some great vehicles. Duncan has a couple in his arsenal there. I mean, you know, the British High Commissioner is waiting for his eyepiece. And other manufacturers have also developed great vehicles which will be acceptable, I believe, to the public. And I remember visiting New York City, and a friend and a colleague, a business partner, he invited me for a drive in his electric vehicle. I won't call the name since Duncan is here, but it was very, very fast and very, very quiet, and had a lot of features in it. You know, approached the car, saw the car coming back. He just, from his mobile device, instructed the car to come back, and the car was already at the right temperature because it was all built into the systems that were being provided for the electric vehicle. And so I have no doubt that the public will find it attractive. But the point that Duncan made about the duty rates needs to be fully addressed. And he's probably quite right when he says that maybe 15% or even lower to get it going will be appropriate. So that is something that we have to press the government to look at the duty regimes around electric vehicles. On the sports side, at the FIA, for a few years now, we've been running Formula E to show the public that you can have sport with an electric vehicle. It doesn't have to be an internal combustion vehicle. And so far, the Formula E is done quite well. Granted, you sometimes need to have two cars because you know, when the battery runs out, you need to switch to another car. But it's working well so far, and the cities in which it has been applied or introduced, the communities have welcomed the EV, electric Formula E. And so what I'm saying here is that electric vehicles is not a boring solution. It is quite good. And as the technology grows and as people invest more, you'll find even more attractive vehicles coming out with greater levels of performance. You get increased luggage space because you don't need the space that is required in the front and the back. So you get literally two trunks, one in the front and one in the back for the vehicles. And so therefore it is something that we should look forward to. And I know the manufacturers are actively working at it in some countries, in some states. There's a mandate for vehicles to become electric vehicles, California being one such state, which is pressing for at least hybrid vehicles to be introduced over time. So there are many opportunities ahead. And of course, it is all surrounds the policy framework that we put in place. I'm happy that the minister mentioned that his electric vehicle policy is coming through. But there are certain things that we have to think about as we go forward. How you deal with insurances for the electric vehicles, how you deal with we spoke about the repairs of the electric vehicles, we spoke about the customs duties, and also the incentives that we should put in place. Should we make it that the toll roads are free for electric vehicles, and parking is free for electric vehicles, to introduce it and to get it accepted by the public at large. The funding for the infrastructure, I'm certain the IDB will be happy to provide funding for the build out of the infrastructure. And of course, the payments for the charging of the vehicles is something that we have to also think about. You know, we heard just this week of the government's plan to introduce digital currency that is ripe for purchase of the electricity at the charging points. And as well, we have to also look at the policy that surrounds how JPS works, because you can then have somebody selling electricity if they are not so approved.
Indeed.
So with that, I close off.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jarrett. And I like the idea of the toll road free for electric vehicles. I think that that's something we can possibly explore. I now turn to our third panelist, Mr. Stuart Barnes, as he gives us his perspective from the finance sector. And as we spoke about, just touched it, insurances, financing, these sorts of, and we have had rich perspectives on the support systems and financing. And just a few questions, and we invite questions from the audience once more. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is how do we see, from your perspective, this sector developing? So I have had the challenge of trying to forecast how many vehicles we're going to have and be prepare for the growth of the sector. What do you see this growth looking like over the next couple of years? And I know you have mentioned the issues of government incentives and duties and the safety codes and so on, but how do you see this happening over the, say, the next 5 years? Is this real or is this just a pipe dream? Is it really going to happen? I'll turn to Duncan. Your comment first.
So, I mentioned before that the supply chain is going to force electric cars down it.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And this is happening because of emission rules in developed markets are forcing manufacturers to make the switch.
And
So
you're
for
feeling
example,
that right now. You're feeling that as well.
In the next 5 years, we will feel it. Right now, we're not.
Okay.
But for example, many countries in Europe have banned diesel engines from 2025. So that will mean that we won't be able to buy a diesel engine car for some makes, just because of something happening far away from here. So the electric market is going to come to us because of the supply chain, no matter what.
Okay.
However, as I'd mentioned before, the market isn't going to select electric cars except for a certain client segment or customer segment. And unless we can sway opinion around the switch to electric cars, we will see slower adoption at the start and having it pick up at the end as we are forced to do it. As I mentioned before, plug-in hybrids are part of the manufacturer's strategy. Plug-in hybrids, combine an internal combustion engine with an electric motor and a battery. And the notion is that you could do your commute using electricity, but you would take your long drive using your engine. So we are also going to see plug-in hybrids forced upon us by the supply chain.
Okay.
So, I think that in this year, you could easily envision 200 to 300 electric cars being in Jamaica if you count plug-in hybrids. And if you counted battery electric only, then perhaps you would be looking at under 100. But I think that this is something that will have exponential growth. Okay. So it would be easy to envision, doubling the volume each year.
Okay.
As people become more accustomed, as the choice widens, and as the supply chain forces it upon us.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Jarrett, your thoughts?
And if you look at the life cycle for a car, it's roughly 10 to 15 years. And in that period of time, you tend to find, cars die and new ones are put in the market. And I think that, unless the government, it all depends on the government, because the government continues to allow Jamaica to receive cars from countries that are forced to change their cars, in other words, the used car market. If you allow a country to accept cars at a lower standards, it may take a little longer. But it all depends on the government and government policy, and which I would encourage the government to look to EVs, combination hybrid vehicles, as a means by which we're going to preserve our environment, meet our commitments to the multilateral agencies and and the international community. So it all depends on governments.
Government incentives, government policy are critical to make this happen. When do you think this will actually begin to trickle down to the ordinary man? You know, one of the things I believe is a sure indicator of whether electric vehicle begins to move is when I can jump into a EV taxi. How do you see that actually happening, getting down to the ordinary Jamaican person?
There's a policy paper which is being prepared by the ministry. I think after that it's going to be circulated to key stakeholders. And we have a discussion in Parliament and so on. So it could take a couple of months, but it will give us an opportunity to push for the public to participate in the development of the framework that will drive this industry. And it will impact a number of persons. As I said, mobility and transportation is a third of the economy.
Early adoption needs some kind of incentive. And when you look at the rate at which the vehicles are being purchased right now, you find that people get sentimental with the old IC vehicles, and they tend to prefer them because they're not certain about how it will equate in terms of value. So when you look at the value proposition, they are looking on what will I gain when I invest in this vehicle. So, tax incentives are stuff that they're going to be looking on. The bank's going to be looking on that as well, because that's going to be a selling point. And also the support services for the EV readiness, the support services to have this ecosystem. We would need to see, or would love to see, some kind of incentive for people to be early adopters. Because when you look at the plan for EVs in the next 10 years, in the next 20, 30 years, there are going to be more EVs than the regular combustion engines. And, as Duncan said, you really don't want to be caught in a situation where you're lagging and you end up with vehicles that are not ones that you can get the parts for early. So as a result of that, I think that when we incentivize, we get people becoming early adopters, and we can accelerate this whole transition into EVs and hybrids.
As we wind down on this sections, one of the things that a lot of people have expressed interest in is what are the developments in terms of businesses and employment opportunities in this sector. How will this sector in its growth affect existing business models, if any at all? I was talking about how we grow businesses, this small man, middle-sized businesses participating in the sector. And is that something that we see as critical to develop at this point in time? How do we need to position ourselves to encourage that? Because I know that for the sector to grow, that those layers of the economy have to feel connected to the sector. It's a difficult one, but do you have some thoughts on that one?
Absolutely. So, we have a relatively high cost of transport in Jamaica. And so, this filters down into economic activity as a cost. And, electric mobility will deliver more efficient energy and will deliver lower transportation costs, provided that the first costs of the vehicles are acceptable. Okay. So if you were to think about somebody making the choice of using an electric van versus a diesel van, you know, they would be able to save maybe 20 to 30% of their fuel costs using an electric van. So, you know, this was the kind of multiplier effect that I think Teresa Turner-Jones spoke about with 2% GDP growth. In addition to that, you know, we are talking about building out a new infrastructure, and Earl alluded to this earlier. So every new electric car that we sell, we have to put in place a charging infrastructure, and maybe more than one. So, you know, so you're going to see small electricians have work to do to install chargers at homes.
Right.
And, you know, because this is an exponential thing, right? It's not that we install 200 and that's it. It's every single year we'll be installing more and more and more as we, you know, replace out the existing aging fleet.
And that, you know, that for me resonates, because a lot of persons are wondering, what is in it for me beyond the vehicle? And I think that if we can communicate that business opportunities exist, that we must begin to position ourselves for, I think it will certainly assist and support us advancing the development of the sector. Mr. Jarrett, your thoughts?
With what Duncan has said, but when you think about electric mobility, don't just think about the car. In Indonesia, you have electric bikes.
Yeah.
And so what you're doing with this mobility policy is to look at mobility in its totality. So you will have jobs which will be created for persons, you know, delivery people who today may not be happy with, you know, the yang. Would be certainly happier with a scooter that's electric. The repair of those vehicles and also the spin-off additional industry that will come out. You talk about the payment services, I mentioned that earlier. How do you pay for electricity? How do you deal with the charging points? What's the protocol that works with these new charging points? As Duncan points out, in your homes, you can plug in your electric vehicle, car or bike, and get it charged, and you may have to do some kind of electrical modification to accommodate that. So I see this is no different from the United States when they built that freeway system, where it creates so much economic growth that we are today not able to even imagine where some of the growth will emerge. And so what we need to do is to embrace this new world. As I said, to create thousands of clean jobs. There's another word that goes in between clean and jobs, but I won't say it here. But, you know, so it's a new world and we need to embrace it and look forward to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I'm closing off now. I was about to take a survey, how many persons in the room drive an electric vehicle. Duncan, do you see any hands? No. We're at the beginning. No hands out yet, but it does say that we are a lot closer in terms of understanding the issues and the parameters that surround the EV. I can tell you as a female, I have been thinking about it, you know, and I've been doing a lot of circular thought about it, and I believe that we can communicate that there is certainly a lot of value in terms of the environmental benefits, the fuel economy, and of course, just I would say the satisfaction of the ride in a vehicle like that. I think it's something that we can definitely promote and encourage. I'm just seeing the questions on the board, and I think we may have considered some of them, you know, like some manufacturers seem opposed to third-party maintenance. Do we expect this sentiment to be prevalent? Could this pose an issue with maintenance in our market? Do you see any issues with maintenance, Duncan?
So electric vehicles have much less maintenance than internal combustion and plug-in hybrids. Car makers during the warranty period are always going to prescribe their authorized network. So it will be no different for electric cars and ICE. But I think, you have to envision a vehicle that has no oil changes, right? Very little cooling fluid to change. That, servicing is about wiper blades and the pollen filter that's filtering the air in the cabin.
And brake pads.
That, brake pad life on an electric vehicle is 3 times longer than the brake pad life on a ICE because you can use the electric motor to slow the car. So it's a different maintenance paradigm than what we're accustomed to. In fact, one casualty might be that technicians have less work to do.
Okay.
Or they do something else.
Or they do something else. And that's one of the things that's certainly very attractive to me as as a lady, that I have less maintenance work to do. And again, we're looking for those nuggets in the development of the sector that we can encourage our nationals to really take on electric vehicle as a part of their day-to-day experience. I want to thank you all for your time today. Thank you. A lot has been said. We have heard about what is critical to incentivize the sector. Government policy is critical. Duncan, you have spoken about the fact that as Jamaicans, the equivalent EV might not be the same size as the one you typically go after, but certainly there are a lot more benefits that we can enjoy. We have to look at our government policy to incentivize the sector. And from the automobile industry, we're saying that, it's not just about electric vehicles, could be the plug-in hybrids, and there are other variants that we must be able to consider. Mr. Jarrett, you spoke about the fact that we must really continue to look at the benefits of it in Jamaica. And the good side is that, the impact on our environment, the opportunities to transition our public transportation, buses and taxis into this sector, the private sector helping that rollout as well. And of course, you spoke about the sports side, which I loved, about the the Formula E. And I would love to see Jamaica doing some Formula J. Let's see how that works out. And, Mr. Bars gave us his view in terms of, the financing institutions are watching the growth of the sector, and they're positioning themselves also to support and to finance the business that would come forth, and even on the electric vehicle side. So today has been the first of several events, conversations around EV. It's certainly not the end of the conversation. JPS as a team is also working on supporting the infrastructure development. We're working on the rollout of an island-wide network of charging stations. Stay tuned for that. And as we close today, let us continue to work at building that sustainable ecosystem around electric vehicles as we look to our tomorrow as a nation and as a leader in the development of technology in the world. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today.